Joining me on the Minuteman Press guest line is Will Flanders, the Research Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
It's a real pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with basics. Help us understand what is the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty.
So we are a law and policy center located in Milwaukee. If you've seen our work, it's probably more likely to be on the legal side. You get involved in a lot of free market issues. We get involved in a lot of educational issues. Generally in support of some conservative principles. That's sort of our basis. On the policy side, I like to say I do a lot of the boring white papers that you might see, and those are a lot of education-focused work, but we get involved in some other areas as well, trying to sort of push positive reforms throughout the state.
I've had the opportunity to spend a little time on the website and read some of the studies, and I strongly urge our listening audience to explore and find out a little bit more. Every viewpoint is an important viewpoint to understand, and you guys bring a lot to the table. I have to congratulate you on the things that you do bring to the table. Your most recent study really caught my eye, in as much as I thought to myself, what is a populist conservative and how do you re-engage them? And you started to answer that question for me. Help define what is a populist conservative.
Yeah, it's something that's sort of been in the news and to some extent for the last few years, but it's really been a little bit intangible for folks, right? What is this group of this voter block? Essentially, the reason we did this work is we know that this group has become an important part of the Republican coalition, the conservative coalition over the past few years. We know these folks have turned out in presidential elections when President Trump has been on the ballot, but not necessarily in other elections. And just in general, right, we need as a conservative think tank to sort of better understand where these folks are coming from. So when we talk about populist conservatives, what we're talking about are folks that are really sort of disconcerted with the sort of powers that be in government. There's a great deal of skepticism that politicians, that big business are looking out for their interests. And there's a general belief that these entities are out for their own interests, are out to get them. So it's sort of a skepticism towards the powers that be across the political world, from politicians themselves to business leaders and things of that nature. It's a little bit different than the traditional conservative movement, where there's sort of more of a basis in traditional free market principles and things of that nature. They come at it from a different angle, though in some ways we often align.
I found it kind of interesting in as much as it redefines the populist movement to an extent. If you go back historically and you look at the composition of the Republican Party, you had a very strong conservative wing of the Republican Party, and also had what the Bushes called the compassionate conservative. Is this progressive conservative somewhat of a rebirth of that compassionate conservative movement?
It's an interesting question. I think that, you can sort of trace the basis of this sort of segment back to maybe the Tea Party movement would be a good basis, in my opinion. There might be less of a concern about, again, ensconcing our beliefs in sort of, Reagan or Milton Friedman, like we've done in the past, and more of an emphasis on getting things done, right? What are we accomplishing that actually moves us towards our goals? And to some extent, the means are less important to this segment of voters. So when you think about the Tea Party, there was a great deal of anger justified about government spending, about going into massive deficits, and they wanted someone that would actually say they're going to do something about this, and a call to action, a sort of less concern again about the pathway we get there, but making sure we're cutting spending, making sure that government isn't benefiting the powerful over the average person. Those are sort of the things that underlie this movement, I think. So the compassionate conservative you might think of a little more moderate. These folks aren't necessarily right in the middle of the pack. They might be a little bit more on the conservative side, but there's certainly some overlap there as well.
Well, and I found it fascinating that as you described those populist-leaning folks with classical conservative principles, the rule of law, federalism, free markets, respect for those opposing viewpoints, and trust in institutions are all those areas that you I guess, measured a degree of faith that people in this movement actually have. And what are some of the major findings from the study?
Yeah, so I think when you were sort of alluding to more of a liberal side to things, I think one of the more eye-opening things for us in this research was that when we asked people, again, I self-identified populist conservatives in this statewide poll, do you think the government should be involved in a number of different areas? And some areas make sense, right? You get at the bottom, there's an overwhelming percentage of people who think government plays a role in tariffs. Government's the only one that does tariffs. Now, we might disagree about whether we should have tariffs or not among populists versus sort of more libertarian-leaning conservatives. But then you get to things like price controls, and we might like to think there's conservative universal opposition to something like price controls. But you do see about 50% of these populist-identified voters saying they're supportive of price controls. And I think in general, what this speaks to is that there's tremendous economic pain right now, right? People feel that prices are rising, things are becoming more expensive. And again, this is a group that's really concerned about action. They want to see things getting done, and they're more willing to accept government intervention to get those things done than again, maybe traditional conservatives would be.
In your research, did you make any differentiation on the basis of the age of the respondent?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do have sort of, within our data set, we do have crosstabs for age. I think what can be said in general is that these voters do tend to be significantly a little bit older than the average conservative voter. A lot of these folks are in the retirement age group. It's sort of like a bifurcated thing, though, because you look at young males in their 20s. There's a good number that are sort of populist-leaning there as well. But the preponderance and the biggest group of these voters is among the older group of voters. It's
interesting to me that one of the ties for a lot of the political thought, contemporary thought of the day, is the mistrust for institutions, and that seems to be somewhat of a near universal feeling, irrespective of age group and even irrespective of political philosophy. Fair statement?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And you can look on the political story of both parties over the past decade and see evidence of this, right? We look at even Francesca Hong and her near nomination here for governor in the state. You could see that as sort of a reaction on the left against people they think are the establishment, right? Crowley didn't like being called the establishment, but that's really what this race was set up as, is establishment versus folks that want to see change. You see it obviously on the Republican side with Trump, very much an anti-establishment figure when he came into the party. To some extent, he may have, taken over the reins of power of the party at this point, but still viewed as more of an outsider. So there is definitely a movement across the board against intellectualism, against sort of the establishment, and those that, again, people are more and more skeptical of the extent to which they're looking out for the interests of the average person.
As we're putting together our messaging for the community, one of the universal points and the entry point, as you call it, is economic pain, and the focus on economic pain that has to be there at the forefront of the message, as opposed to it being something abstract and without substance. Talk about that, please.
Yeah, so as a conservative think tank, right? Or we sometimes end up feeling like we're, or people might get the impression we're like an ivory tower, group, and we certainly don't want to give that impression. But we'll talk about things again, like in the context of Milton Friedman or the Austrian economic school, and that's not what folks want to hear. The average person isn't going to be compelled by those sorts of messages, particularly in a time like today, again, where their grocery bill is $100 higher than it was 7 or 8 years ago, right? Where, car payments and housing is becoming more and more unaffordable. Even for the older group of folks, they see it with their kids or their grandkids who, may be struggling to buy a home. So you can't be dismissive of those issues. These folks want to see you acknowledge the issues that they're going through, that all of us are going through in society today. And, whether our political side is in power or not, they want to see acknowledgement that there are problems, and then they want to have that followed up by specific actions and how you're going to work to address them, rather than sort of nebulous, sort of pie in the sky sorts of ideas. They want specifics about what will be done and what actions will be taken to make sure these things are actually fixed.
The economic pain is a real entry point, and it's something that is being across the board. It's something that all are feeling, and certainly it's an area that both philosophies, or all philosophies, really have to pick up. It's not one of those. The whole theme seems to be that we don't have the trust in the national level that we used to. We don't have the faith that we're headed in the right direction. We don't have the clarity of that national policy, and people now tend to be more focused on where they believe they can have an impact, and that seems to be the local level. Fair observation? Yeah,
absolutely. That's what we see in our data. We did ask folks, who do you trust the most, and we had a sort of large number of different categories. Now, it is important for the populist group. President Trump is still at the very top, and this was done a couple months ago. May have changed slightly since then. But once you get past the president, the most trusted groups are all local groups. We have, local election day workers, your local county sheriff, your member of Congress, so not Congress as a whole. That trust is very low, but your own member of Congress. So, folks do see trust, much more at the local level, at folks they could potentially interact with on a regular basis. And that's important for, when we're thinking about broader policies, who do you want to be delivering the messages? The more you can get those messages delivered by someone who's local, has credibility in the community, it's going to be much more effective than, someone from an outside group coming in and trying to tell folks how it is.
Well, and the one observation I will offer is there's much more trust in local media than there is in the national media, based upon the survey results that you have, and that's an interesting finding in my mind's eye, because we're going through an era when local media, the whole face of local journalism is changing dramatically. The day of the daily newspaper, the day of the fully staffed newsroom is long gone, and it's comes down to a question of how do people gain and gather news and information. That's a tough part of the equation. Do you have trust because you have greater access to reliable information, or what you believe to be reliable, or do you have trust simply because you feel like it is closer to home?
Yeah, that was something we wanted to get more granular on, because a lot of times in polls you'll just see, do you trust the media in general, right? We want to differentiate local media from national media. And, while 50% of these populist folks say they have some faith in, they have some level of faith in local media, it drops precipitously to 28% when you talk about national media. So there's a substantial gap there that's absolutely important. Now, what people are thinking of with local media, we have folks like you guys, we have local radio. We've really seen a proliferation of more localized online news sources that are replacing newspapers, but that are focused on state or communities. There is a growth in that, even as we see sort of the traditional local news go away. So folks are receptive to that, and they want to see that. And I think that is an important point going forward, is that, again, it's somebody you could interact with. You see the reporter at the local bar or at the coffee shop, right? Not someone, again, coming into your community from the outside that's going to face a huge level of skepticism. And do they actually understand what's going on here? Probably not.
How do people build trust in local institutions? Is any insights from the survey?
It's a good question. I think, to some extent that might be beyond what we can actually, say in the survey, because this is just a one-time snapshot. But I do think there's the interpersonal interaction that we've talked about, and there's just the credibility of being able to, talk about what's going on, with road construction, talk about the data center down the road, folks that have a innate knowledge of these actual issues that are happening at the local level. Populists, and I think this is probably something that's across the board, populist conservatives and others, that sort of is a entry point to get you through the door, right? This person actually knows what's going on in my community, and therefore I'm more willing to listen to what they have to say on a wide variety of other topics.
Do you sense that we have a stronger sense of skepticism for truth, and trying to find accuracy in news reporting, in information availability? Is that something that is more pronounced now than previously?
I think that's absolutely the case. You go back to quite a long time ago at this point, right, when we had the three news networks and Walter Cronkite, and most people, if you polled in 1975 or 1970, would say they had a high level of trust that those outlets were providing accurate information. Over the decades, we've seen things going back to Dan Rather with the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. We've seen media on the other side, to some extent, sometimes stretch the truth as well on issues like the 2020 election. So there is a great deal of skepticism that any news outlet isn't coming through a filter. It's healthy to, be skeptical of what you hear and understand where everyone's perspective is coming from. But I think we may have gone so far the other direction, basically, that nothing can be trusted if it comes from a, neutral or unfamiliar source, that it really makes it hard for anybody to believe much of anything out there. And I think as we get into our silos more, as news is more and more filtered to be consistent with what people actually already believe, that just sort of exacerbates it, right? Nothing can be believed unless it comes from my particular silo. And that definitely is a problem for our sort of democratic institutions as a whole.
Well, and you speak very specifically to the fact that transparency and verification does build trust. And at the same time, we're dealing with a mistrust for the sources of that information, that data that would help build that trust. Makes for kind of a challenging contradiction of circumstances.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. And I think it is worth pointing out, as you sort of alluded to, that, when we talk about things that would build support, very rare you'll do a poll of anything and you'll see 90+% people saying they agree with something. But when we talked about, transparency in government and sunshine laws, when we talked about there being more government audits, those things are over 90% support issues among this group of voters. And I think it's one of the few areas we might actually find, bipartisan support. If we polled folks who are voting on the other side and on the Democratic side, I think there's a great deal of support for transparency and more auditing as well. That's sort of a universal issue. So, if you want these folks to rebuild their trust in institutions, that's definitely a pathway to do it. Make sure they can see under the curtain, see what's actually happening. That goes to things like open records requests, making sure they're followed through on and making sure they actually get fulfilled. And it goes to things like having open hearings and making sure that folks know on everything from elections to, regulatory policy, what's happening within state and federal government.
And again, it's that renewal of interest in things that are happening at the local level, where you do have a sense that you may have some impact, whereas things happening at the state or the federal level, our ability to clearly have an impact on anything is extremely limited. And it makes that whole verification process even more challenging, because you're really trying to focus on getting to understand your local institutions and why your local institutions behave in the fashion that they do.
Yeah, that's right. It sort of adds to the feeling of helplessness that a lot of these folks have. And, the reason they may not turn out, in non-presidential elections is because they don't necessarily feel that anyone's really speaking and going to take action on their specific needs and their specific interests. So to the extent to which we can show tangible results of implementing policies that will actually lead to better outcomes on things like prices. That stuff is very important to this group of voters, because as soon as you just purely go negative, it confirms their existing beliefs that everyone's everyone's against them, and they're not going to turn out without someone who has a message of action, not necessarily a positive message, but a message of action.
And you hit it on the head. There's not necessarily always that positive message of action that's coming out and suggesting that we can do this, that, or the other thing that will make it better. Instead, it's just simply, this is wrong and leave it at that. And we tend to find ourselves in that world where it's extremely easy to take a firm position on something and never bend. Because you don't trust any other information that has come forward. The only fact that I trust is the one that says this is where I develop my opinion, is this fact and nothing else matters.
Yeah, there's a in political science, that's my background. There's this concept of motivated reasoning, right? We'll sort of take in and immediately believe something that aligns with what we already want to believe. But if something's counter to that, we'll sort of put up our roadblocks and say, well, can I really trust this source? So it's good to have that skepticism across the board. But we definitely, as humans, it's sort of psychologically innate that we'll just believe things that already align with what we want to believe and reject everything that doesn't. And again, that's not anything specific to this group of voters. That's just a human condition in general that's sort of challenging to work through.
Yeah, absolutely. In your study, you did spend a bit of time asking the question of as it relates to transparency and verification, and you spent some time talking about the election system and. In the election system, is it a safe statement, or is it a realistic statement to say that there is a healthy skepticism about our election system from a security of voting perspective?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's almost the majority of voters, the majority of the ones that said they identify as MAGA, don't trust the 2020 election results. They do trust the 2024 results more. And we looked forward. We said, do you think the 2028 elections will be conducted fairly? We were in the 60% range. There's a decent level of distrust there. Things I think that are important to note there is it's not their local election, in their community, maybe a rural community in Wisconsin they don't trust. It's what's happening in Milwaukee. Obviously, we saw more issues with the most recent election. It's what's happening nationally. They don't like what's going on in California, where there's no voter ID. One thing we did ask about in this poll is if the SAVE Act could be passed, would that bolster your faith in elections? And that was a overwhelmingly positive position as well. People want to see voter ID, and just to be sure that everyone who's voting is a legal person that's allowed to be voting. And, that is, again, an issue that, is very popular among this group of voters, but you do find across the board majority support for. So it's something that ought to be bipartisan, though obviously it hasn't been implemented bipartisanly across the country. It's
an interesting environment that we live in. I go back to just the most recent primary here in Wisconsin, where you had a candidate who came forward at the last minute and did not like to be called establishment, running against somebody who was a avowed liberal, and it created a dynamic that I don't think we've seen in this state in a long time. What's the read there?
Yeah, I think again it's sort of consistent with what you've seen with Bernie Sanders over the past few years, with what you've seen with folks on the Republican side that are able to tap into the sort of populist rhetoric, and it's the same idea. People across the board feel like things aren't getting done. We're in a time of stagnation, and they're being left behind. And I think that applies to folks on the left like Hong, and it applies to some extent to what we've seen with the rise of populism within the conservative movement as well. It's a story of wanting action. It's a story of wanting folks that speak to you on an individual level and not as just part of some voting bloc.
We had a texter who just texted in and basically said, "Can you explain then why the populist conservatives still support Donald Trump?"
It's a challenging question, and I think it is the fact that his rhetoric certainly very much aligns with what we've talked about today, right? Whether that's always been followed through with at level of getting policies across the board certainly has not been the case. But the rhetoric and the I'm looking out for you, I care about your problems, I think is the biggest story of the rise of Trump and his continued support among the MAGA segment of voters, for sure.
It's a fascinating study, and it's worth picking up and reading. There's a lot of insights that I found refreshing and intriguing intellectually. That it causes me to want to take a harder look at the issues and do my own research. You spend a little bit of time talking about some of the key findings, and one of them that sticks out to me was the amount of the community, at least from the survey, that is in strong support. 98% say addressing corruption and transparency is important, is critical, and yet is it directed at the national level? Is it directed to the state level, or is it directed at the local level?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think that might be one where if we can do a follow-up study, that might be good to delve into a little bit more deeply. I think if you ask most of these folks, they would say at all levels of government, right? But what they're actually thinking of, it's probably some of both, but a lot of it might be at the national level, because that's what a lot of these folks are most focused on, because they're not turning out necessarily in local and state elections as much. So across the board, I'm sure you'd see high support, but I think the focus might be more on what they're seeing nationally.
It's a question worth pursuing in my mind's eye. Will Flanders, Research Director, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Tell us where we can do a follow-up and learn more about the organization and in particular about this study.
Yeah, absolutely. So the website, or the paper, is available on our website, will-law.org. The title is Bridging the Gap. I don't know if I ever mentioned that throughout this, but you can go there and find this study as well as a lot of the other work that we've been doing, both legally and on the policy side.
Will Flanders, always a pleasure. Appreciate your insights and look forward to another conversation down the road.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.